You know how most galactic empires collapse from rebellion or invasion? Humanity tried something different. We surrendered. But not the way you're thinking. This wasn't defeat. It was the opening move in a strategy so audacious it rewrote the rules of interstellar politics. When Captain Rex Valdez walked into the Galactic Council chamber, everyone expected submission. What they got was a revolution disguised as capitulation. You know how most diplomatic greetings are designed to make you feel included? Like the universal translator kicks in and suddenly you're being welcomed to some grand interstellar community. The Galactic Council's first contact protocol looked like diplomacy on the surface, but it was really compliance theater. They'd perfected this dance over millennia, make the new species feel special while simultaneously placing them in the exact box the Council wanted. Ambassador Click 7 opened with, "Greetings, primitive carbon-based life forms." Now that wasn't some translation error or cultural misunderstanding. That was a deliberate framing device. Calling us primitive while acknowledging we were carbon-based meant they'd done their homework, but chose to emphasize our perceived backwardness. It was like showing up to a job interview and having them compliment your shoes while pointing out you're wearing last season's fashion. The Council's entire approach treated humans like a resource that needed proper management. They saw our population numbers, our industrial capacity, our willingness to work in harsh environments. What they didn't see were citizens. We were potential labor that needed to be properly directed, like finding a particularly strong draft animal that just needed the right harness. Most species would have accepted this hierarchy. When you've been watching the Galactic Council's ships park in your orbit, seeing technology that might as well be magic, you tend to accept your place in the pecking order. You thank them for the honor of being noticed at all. But humans have this stubborn tendency to question why the pecking order exists in the first place. We look at someone claiming authority and immediately wonder what gives them the right. That single phrase, primitive carbon-based life forms, told us everything we needed to know before negotiations even started. It revealed that the Council saw relationships as transactional, species as assets to be managed, and diplomacy as a means of control rather than collaboration. The real genius of their insult was how it framed the entire relationship. By opening with that designation, they established the terms. We were the primitive ones needing guidance. They were the advanced civilization providing structure. It was a power move disguised as a greeting, like a landlord handing you a lease while reminding you they own the building. That moment told us we weren't being invited to join a community. We were being assigned a role. The Council had already decided what humanity was for, and negotiation would simply be about the details of our servitude. They'd done this dance with hundreds of species before us, and it always ended the same way, which makes what happened next almost poetic. Instead of being offended or trying to negotiate better terms within their framework, we recognized the entire system was flawed. That greeting became the foundation of our entire strategy. If they wanted to treat us as primitive, we'd use that underestimation against them. The Council's arrogance in those first moments became their greatest vulnerability. Look, I've watched enough interstellar negotiations to know when someone's offering you the short end of the stick. The Council presented their terms wrapped in this shiny packaging about joining galactic society, like they were handing us tickets to the best show in the universe. They had holographic displays showing humans working alongside other species, contributing to grand projects that would span star systems. It all looked impressive until you read the fine print. Their actual proposal assigned humanity to manual labor contracts across 17 classified hazardous worlds. We're talking about atmospheric processing plants on toxic planets, asteroid mining operations with casualty rates that would make an insurance actuary quit, and terraforming projects where the life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. The compensation package consisted of basic nutritional supplements and standardized habitat modules, essentially food and shelter, like we were livestock that needed maintaining. Chancellor Vex Prime actually used the phrase nourishment and protection as if he were describing some benevolent childcare program rather than indentured servitude. The Council's entire economic model was built on this kind of exploitation. They called it indentured contribution to make it sound noble. They'd convinced themselves that providing the basic necessities of life was adequate payment for generations of labor. It was like offering someone a glass of water and calling it fair, payment for building your house. What fascinated me was how, Genuinely confused they seemed when humans didn't immediately celebrate this opportunity. The council delegates kept looking at our negotiation team like we were malfunctioning androids when we started asking about wages, worker rights, and contract durations. They'd structured this system over millennia, where advanced species provided direction and primitive species provided labor, and it never occurred to them that someone might question the fundamental fairness of the arrangement. Rex Valdez's laughter during the proposal wasn't just surprise or offense. It was this deep, rolling sound of recognition. He wasn't laughing at them. He was laughing at the sheer emptiness of their moral framework. That moment clarified everything. We weren't dealing with malicious overlords, but with a system so entrenched in its own assumptions that it couldn't recognize slavery, even when it was drafting the contracts itself. The council's offer revealed their core operating principle. Efficiency mattered more than dignity. Production mattered more than personhood. They'd optimized their galactic economy like someone tuning a machine, removing any unnecessary parts like individual rights or fair compensation. Their entire civilization ran on this inherited privilege that they never questioned, because nobody had ever given them a reason to. So we stopped trying to negotiate better terms within their broken system. The laughter wasn't the end of the discussion. It was the beginning of a different conversation entirely. We realized that if they wanted to treat us as primitive labor, we'd have to show them what primitive ingenuity actually looked like when properly motivated. Their offer became the blueprint for our response, not because we accepted it, but because it showed us exactly what we were fighting against. Let me tell you about human engineering under pressure. The United Earth Defiance wasn't designed by committee meetings or focus groups. It emerged from shipyards that operated on 24-hour shifts, where engineers solved problems with whatever materials they could scavenge or repurpose. They built that ship like someone assembling furniture with instructions written in a language they only half understood, making educated guesses and hoping the whole thing wouldn't collapse when they put weight on it. We used existing orbital infrastructure, mining platforms, cargo haulers, even decommissioned orbital habitats, and retrofitted them with weapon systems that were more theoretical than tested. The Council's dreadnoughts had smooth, polished hulls that reflected starlight like jewelry. Our ships looked like someone welded together industrial equipment and hoped for the best. Exposed conduits ran along exterior surfaces, armor plating came in mismatched grades, and you could see the welding seams from 3 kilometers away. But that roughness hid some brutally clever design choices. Every component was overbuilt to withstand twice the stress it would theoretically encounter. Where Council engineers specified precisely calibrated components, our teams used bulkier systems that could fail gracefully rather than catastrophically. They prioritized redundancy over elegance, designing systems that could keep functioning even when partially damaged. A Council ship might lose one critical component and become a floating coffin. Our ships could take multiple system failures and still limp home. The Council designed their fleet for psychological impact. Those sweeping lines and polished surfaces were meant to intimidate before a single shot was fired. We built for survival, prioritizing shield emitters over aesthetics, weapon placement over symmetry, and engine reliability over sleek profiles. Our ships didn't need to look impressive in diplomatic parades. They needed to withstand particle beam impacts and keep their crews alive. This philosophical difference became our greatest advantage. The Council's technology had evolved toward perfection through generations of incremental improvements. They'd refined their designs to eliminate inefficiencies, creating elegant solutions that worked beautifully within established parameters. Human engineering embraced messiness. We built systems that could operate outside specifications, that could be repaired with improvised parts, that could function in conditions the designers never anticipated. The Defiance's compensator weapon became the perfect example of this approach. It wasn't some sleek energy projector that fit neatly into the ship's contours. It was this bulky external assembly that looked like someone mounted industrial machinery to the hull. The Council's weapons followed established physical principles that everyone understood. Our engineers treated physics more like guidelines than rules, building systems that technically shouldn't work according to conventional understanding. At one point, the engineering team had to solve the heat dissipation problem that conventional wisdom said made relativistic kinetic weapons impossible. They didn't try to reinvent thermal management. They just accepted the massive heat buildup and designed a coolant system that could handle temperatures that would vaporize most alloys. It was like dealing with a house fire by building a bigger bucket rather than trying to prevent the fire altogether. The compensator became this beautiful contradiction, a weapon that defied engineering conventions while being built from completely conventional components. It was less about breakthrough technology and more about stubborn refusal to accept that something couldn't be done with the materials at hand. That mindset would define our entire approach to the conflict that followed. You know how most galactic weapons follow established physical laws? They use focused energy beams, plasma containment fields, phased particle arrays, weapons that look impressive and operate within well-understood physics. The compensator wasn't like that. It was essentially a relativistic crowbar made of tungsten, a weapon so straightforward in concept that the Council's engineers had dismissed it as theoretical centuries earlier. They'd calculated the energy requirements, the heat dissipation problems, the structural stresses, and concluded it was impractical. Our engineers looked at those same calculations and treated impossible as a suggestion rather than a limitation. The weapon accelerated a 2-meter tungsten rod to 15% light speed, using a series of magnetic coils that ran along the Defiance's dorsal spine. Each coil fired in sequence, adding velocity in increments that shouldn't have been possible without tearing the projectile apart. The Council's analysis said the G-forces would vaporize any solid material long before it reached target velocity. Our solution was to make the rod spin-stabilized and gradually increase acceleration along the length of the launch assembly, like someone pushing a child on a swing with perfectly timed little pushes rather than one big shove. This wasn't some elegant energy weapon with bright colors and clean lines. It was brute force physics applied with terrifying simplicity. The tungsten rod didn't need to penetrate shields. It arrived with so much kinetic energy that shield technology became irrelevant. The Council's defensive systems were designed to dissipate energy weapons over time, to absorb plasma impacts, to deflect particle beams. They had no answer for an object moving at relativistic speeds that carried the equivalent energy of a small asteroid impact. Our engineering teams built what should have remained theoretical. They solved the heat problem by designing a liquid cooling system that used the ship's own emergency coolant reserves, accepting that firing the weapon would temporarily disable other systems. They addressed structural stress by mounting the entire assembly on hydraulic dampeners that absorbed recoil that would have torn a conventional ship apart. Every component was overbuilt, redundant, and designed to fail safely rather than elegantly. The compensator demonstrated that human ingenuity could outpace galactic conventional wisdom precisely because we weren't burdened by centuries of established doctrine. The Council's technology had evolved along certain predictable paths: more efficient energy weapons, better shield matrices, faster engines. They'd optimized within their framework until they couldn't imagine solutions outside it. We approached problems with fresh eyes and a willingness to accept messy, inefficient solutions that actually worked. But the real test wasn't whether the weapon could be built or whether it could reach theoretical velocities. The question was what would happen when that tungsten rod actually hit something. The Council's dreadnoughts were the most advanced warships in known space, with shields that could withstand sustained bombardment from entire fleets. Their defensive technology represented millennia of refinement and improvement. Everyone knew the rules of space combat, and those rules said energy weapons were the only practical option for piercing advanced shielding. What happened next would rewrite those rules completely. Look, I've heard countless captains make battlefield declarations across half the galaxy. Some shout dramatic threats, some deliver grim ultimatums. A few even try poetic speeches they probably rehearsed in front of a mirror. Rex Valdez's transmission to the Council fleet was supposed to follow a very specific script: the formal surrender of human forces, acknowledgement of Council authority, acceptance of their terms. The Council expected contrition, maybe some bargaining for slightly better conditions. The usual dance of defeated commanders trying to save face while giving up everything. Instead, he opened the channel with that calm, almost conversational tone and said, "I've got a better idea." 5 words that changed galactic history. This wasn't some impulsive act of defiance or dramatic rebellion for its own sake. It was a calculated strategic pivot that recognized the fundamental truth of our situation. Playing by the Council's rules meant accepting their framework, and their framework was designed to ensure we always lost. They'd built a game where the house always won, and Rex decided rather than trying to beat them at their own game, he'd change the game entirely. The council expected submission. What they got was creative destruction disguised as communication. His delivery made it even more powerful. No raised voice, no dramatic pauses, just that flat, matter-of-fact tone like someone suggesting a better route to avoid traffic. He sounded like an engineer pointing out a flaw in the design, rather than a military commander rejecting surrender. That calmness undermined their entire psychological framework. They were prepared for anger, for desperation, for negotiation. They weren't prepared for someone treating their ultimatum like a poorly thought-out proposal that needed revision. That single phrase became the rallying cry for human resistance because it encapsulated our entire approach. It wasn't about rejecting their authority through force alone. It was about rejecting the very premise of their authority. The council's power depended on everyone accepting their rules, their definitions, their terms of engagement. By saying, "I've got a better idea," Rex was fundamentally challenging that entire structure. He wasn't just refusing to surrender. He was refusing to acknowledge that surrender was the only option. The transmission reverberated through every ship in both fleets. You could feel the shift in atmosphere, the council's forces waiting for the formalities to conclude so they could begin the occupation, our crews suddenly understanding that the plan had changed. That phrase became shorthand for human stubbornness, for our refusal to accept predetermined outcomes, for our willingness to look at established systems and ask why they had to work that way. It was less a battle cry and more a statement of principle, that better solutions exist if you're willing to question the assumptions everyone else accepts. Which brings us to the moment when theory became practice, when that better idea met the reality of council military technology. The compensator weapon was charged, the targeting solutions were calculated, and everyone was about to discover whether human ingenuity could actually break a system that had dominated galactic politics for millennia. The council's dreadnought represented everything about their power, immense, polished, intimidating. Our answer was a tungsten rod and a different way of thinking about problems. Let me describe what happens when conventional warfare meets unconventional thinking. The council's dreadnought was the largest compliance enforcement vessel ever deployed, a 12-kilometer-long monument to intimidation that had never faced meaningful resistance. Its polished hull reflected the stars like a mobile palace, and its energy shields could withstand sustained bombardment from an entire battle group. They sent this masterpiece of galactic engineering to ensure humanity understood the futility of resistance. Our single tungsten rod tore through it. At 15% light speed, physics stopped being theoretical and started being spectacularly practical. The kinetic energy transfer wasn't just destructive, it was transformative. The rod didn't so much penetrate the ship as it caused the ship to cease being a coherent structure. Molecular bonds failed, armored plating vaporized, and the entire dreadnought underwent rapid, unscheduled disassembly in a flash of light that temporarily blinded sensors across the sector. Their shields, optimized for energy dispersion and particle deflection, offered exactly as much protection as a sheet of paper against a meteor strike. The defensive systems were designed around centuries of combat data that said kinetic weapons couldn't achieve meaningful velocities in space combat. They'd solved for energy weapons, plasma cannons, particle beams, all the civilized ways of making things explode. Nobody had considered the possibility that someone would simply throw a very dense object very, very fast. The explosion wasn't just physically destructive, it was psychologically devastating. The Council had never seen a capital ship destroyed so completely in a single engagement. Their tactical doctrine assumed fleet actions would involve extended exchanges of fire, shield depletion calculations, and gradual system failures. This was different. One moment their flagship existed, the next moment it was an expanding cloud of superheated gas and debris. It violated their understanding of how space combat was supposed to work. This wasn't how warfare functioned in their experience. Their simulations, their war games, their centuries of military tradition, none of it accounted for a weapon that could erase a dreadnought in milliseconds. The psychological impact rippled through their entire command structure. Officers who had trained their entire careers for methodical fleet engagements suddenly faced something that made their tactics irrelevant. Their confidence in technological superiority evaporated in that single flash of light. One shot from what they'd considered an improvised weapon had destroyed their most powerful ship. The compensator wasn't some secret superweapon. It was basic physics applied without regard for conventional wisdom. The Council's response to this demonstration was entirely predictable within their framework of thinking. If one human ship could do this with improvised technology, then clearly the solution was to send overwhelming force. They decided to deploy their entire available fleet, convinced that numerical superiority would solve what technological advantage could not. The irony was that they were still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. They saw the compensator as a problem of scale. If one weapon could destroy one ship, then 50 ships should require 50 weapons. They completely missed the fundamental shift in warfare philosophy. We weren't playing the same game anymore. And their response proved they still didn't understand the rules had changed. So they gathered their fleet, confident that traditional military doctrine would prevail against what they still considered primitive improvisation. You know how most species would surrender when outnumbered 50-1? They'd look at the tactical displays, calculate the overwhelming odds, and decide survival meant accepting terms. The Council sent their entire third fleet, 50 capital ships with full support craft, expecting that kind of calculation. They'd done this before with rebellious species who overestimated their capabilities. Show enough force, demonstrate the logistical impossibility of resistance, and watch the opposition collapse under the weight of reality. We looked at 50 ships and saw 50 problems that needed solving with available resources. Our asteroid mining operations became weapons manufacturing facilities almost overnight. Those massive orbital refinements that were supposed to process raw materials for Council projects, they started hollowing out asteroids instead, creating hollow shells that could be packed with fusion charges from decommissioned power plants. Our engineers turned resource extraction equipment into weapon delivery systems, repurposing magnetic accelerators that were designed to move ore into systems that could propel multi-million-ton rocks at tactical velocities. These weren't precision weapons, they were area denial systems on a planetary scale. The Council called them planet crackers, but that missed the point. They were strategic tools that made traditional fleet formations irrelevant. Why engage 50 ships when you could threaten the worlds they were protecting? Their numerical advantage meant nothing against weapons that could render entire systems uninhabitable. The Council was fighting a war of fleet engagements and territorial control while we were redefining the fundamental rules of conflict. They kept trying to apply conventional military doctrine to a situation that had moved beyond conventional understanding. Their admirals deployed screening vessels, established battle lines, coordinated fleet movements. All the tactics that had worked for centuries against species that played by established rules. We weren't playing their game anymore. Our planet crackers weren't aimed at their ships. They were aimed at the strategic realities that made those ships important. Why fight a fleet when you can make the reason for that fleet's existence disappear? Space itself became our arsenal. We used navigation hazards as weapons, turned industrial infrastructure into military assets, repurposed civilian technology for combat applications. The Council's approach required specialized military construction facilities, trained personnel, established supply chains. Our approach used whatever was available and made it work through creative application of basic principles. They were building custom solutions while we were adapting existing systems to new purposes. The Council began to realize they weren't fighting rebels in the traditional sense. Rebellion implies working within the existing framework to change leadership or policy. We were challenging the framework itself. Their military superiority depended on technological dominance and established doctrine. We operated outside both categories. Using technology they considered primitive in ways they hadn't imagined, following tactical principles that didn't exist in their manuals. At one point, their intelligence analysts had to admit this conflict resembled nothing in their historical databases. They were fighting innovation itself, and innovation doesn't follow predictable patterns or respect established boundaries. The very thing that made them powerful, centuries of refined military tradition, became their greatest liability against an opponent that refused to acknowledge tradition mattered. Look, fear is a powerful motivator in galactic politics. The Council's member species watched human victories stack up and started doing the math in their own security councils. Defense ministers who had budget meetings about maintaining peacekeeping forces suddenly found themselves calculating how many ships they'd need if humanity turned its attention their way. The anxiety wasn't about one, rebellious species anymore. It was about the precedent being set and the potential chain reaction. The Council's territories began activating reserve fleets that hadn't seen service in generations. Shipyards that normally produced civilian transports started retrofitting them with weapon mounts. Planets that had enjoyed centuries of peace under Council protection suddenly found themselves hosting military exercises and fortification projects. The very stability that the Council had maintained through controlled dominance was being threatened by the unpredictability of human resistance. Species that had never questioned Council authority began having quiet conversations in diplomatic corridors. They'd accepted the galactic order as permanent, like weather patterns or gravitational constants. Now they were watching the architects of that order struggle against a species that refused to follow established patterns. The psychological impact was profound. If humans could challenge the Council successfully, maybe others could too. The unthinkable was becoming increasingly thinkable across a dozen sovereign systems. Humanity's stubborn refusal to lose was destabilizing everything the Council had built. Their entire system depended on predictable responses to demonstrated power. When they showed force, species were supposed to submit. When they offered terms, civilizations were supposed to negotiate within established parameters. Humanity kept responding in ways that made no sense within their framework. Technological improvisation, strategic innovation, and this annoying tendency to treat impossible scenarios as engineering challenges rather than barriers. The Council faced existential anxiety about who would survive the coming upheaval. Military analysts ran simulations that showed cascading rebellions if humanity succeeded. Economic models predicted system-wide disruption if the Council's enforcement mechanisms failed. Political scientists warned that the entire concept of centralized galactic governance might not survive contact with a species that treated authority as something to be earned rather than inherited. They weren't just fighting a war. They were fighting to preserve a civilization model that had dominated for millennia. Rex and his officers watched this escalation with growing concern. They realized winning completely might be as bad as losing. Total victory would mean destroying the Council's infrastructure, creating a power vacuum that could plunge the galaxy into chaos. Various species would scramble for advantage. Old rivalries would resurface, and the resulting conflict could make the current war look like a minor border dispute. They needed a solution that changed the system without collapsing it entirely. So they developed the most audacious plan in military history. Instead of pursuing total victory through force, they would engineer a controlled transformation of galactic politics. The plan involved using the Council's own procedures against them, leveraging their obsession with protocol and precedent to create legal pathways for change. It was less about destroying their enemy, and more about giving them a graceful way to evolve into something better. The military campaign had been about proving they couldn't be ignored. The next phase would be about offering everyone a better alternative. Let me tell you about the most brilliant military deception I've witnessed across 17 systems. Rex proposed surrendering in person to the Galactic Council, a move that looked like either complete capitulation or strategic suicide to every observer watching the tactical feeds. Military analysts across the galaxy were placing bets on whether this was desperation or some hidden play we hadn't calculated yet. Even our own command staff thought he'd lost his mind when he first floated the idea in the strategy meeting. The Council preparation told you everything about their expectations. They arranged a victory ceremony with full diplomatic protocols, complete with recording devices to document humanity's submission for archival purposes. They assembled representatives from 50 different species in their main chamber, creating this overwhelming visual of galactic unity against a single rebellious race. Their entire setup was designed to emphasize our isolation and their consolidated power, like putting a single defendant in a massive courtroom filled with prosecutors. What they didn't understand was that Rex was using their expectation of submission against them. He recognized that their psychological framework demanded certain rituals of defeat, and he was willing to perform those rituals to get access to their central command structure. The Council prepared for a victory ceremony, while we prepared for a revolution disguised as surrender. Their people polished medals and rehearsed speeches while our team prepared transmission, protocols and strategic positioning. Their chamber was specifically Designed to intimidate visitors through scale and symbolism, the high ceilings made individuals feel small, the seating arrangements emphasized hierarchy, and the lighting focused attention on the council dais where power visibly resided. Most species would have been psychologically overwhelmed by the environment, internalizing the message that they were Weibutsu Daoda before galactic authority. We saw that same chamber as a stage with perfect acoustics and built-in recording equipment that would broadcast our message across every member world. This was theater as much as strategy, a performance where the audience didn't realize they were also players in the drama. Rex arrived aboard a ship called the Peacemaker, a name that itself became a psychological weapon when contrasted with what was about to happen. The vessel appeared harmless on approach, its design emphasizing diplomatic functions over military capability, which only reinforced the Council's assumption that this was genuine surrender. Chancellor Vex Prime opened with the expected declaration about witnessing the surrender of humanity and resolving the conflict, framing everything within their narrative of restored order and accepted dominance. The recording devices activated, presumably to document our humiliation for historical archives and training materials. What they were actually recording was the beginning of their own organizational collapse, though they wouldn't realize it until much later. What looked like defeat was actually the opening move in a completely different game. Rex wasn't there to surrender human sovereignty. He was there to demonstrate that the Council's entire power structure was built on psychological manipulation rather than genuine authority. By walking into their most intimidating space and treating it like just another room, he began undermining centuries of carefully constructed dominance psychology before he even spoke a word, which brings us to what happened when he actually walked into their chamber and faced the assembled leadership of the galactic community. The atmosphere was thick with expectation and ceremony, every detail designed to emphasize this moment of final submission. You know how power structures use architecture to reinforce authority? The Galactic Council's chambers were a masterclass in psychological manipulation through design. The ceiling stretched up into darkness so high you couldn't see where it ended, making everyone standing on the floor look appropriately insignificant. The walls were lined with banners from every member species, arranged in perfect formation like soldiers at attention, a visual reminder of the Council's consolidated influence. Every material was cold-polished stone or gleaming metal that reflected light in precise angles, creating an environment that felt more like a museum exhibit than a meeting space. The seating arrangement placed the council members on a raised dais that wrapped around the central presentation area, meaning anyone standing in the center was completely surrounded by representatives who effectively looked down on them from all sides. The lighting focused entirely on the central speaking area, while leaving the council seats in partial shadow, reinforcing who was being examined and who was doing the examining. Even the acoustics were designed to amplify sounds from the center, while muffling noise from the perimeter, making the speaker's voice echo slightly as if they were addressing an immense, unseen audience. Most species would have been psychologically overwhelmed by this environment. The sheer scale of everything made individuals feel like insects under examination, triggering deep-seated responses about hierarchy and place. You could watch delegates from newly admitted species physically shrink into themselves when they entered, their posture changing as they unconsciously accepted the message the architecture was broadcasting about their relative importance in the galactic order. But humans have this annoying habit of not being impressed by grandeur. Rex walked into that chamber and saw something completely different from what the designers intended. Where they saw intimidation, he saw insecurity. Where they saw power projection, he saw overcompensation. The sheer effort that went into making visitors feel small revealed how much the council needed that psychological advantage to maintain control. Truly confident authority doesn't need to scream its dominance through architecture. It can speak in normal tones. Rex recognized the chamber not as evidence of their strength, but as proof of their fragility. The elaborate design, the careful positioning, the controlled lighting, it all indicated a power structure that feared what might happen if people stopped being impressed by the spectacle. They'd built this theater of authority because they understood that without the performance, their actual claim to power was relatively thin. The production value was compensating for substance. The very architecture meant to intimidate became evidence of their underlying weakness. Instead of feeling small, Rex saw an opportunity. The chamber was essentially a perfectly designed stage with built-in amplification and recording systems, all aimed at the central speaking area. They'd created the ideal platform for someone who wanted to address the entire galactic community with maximum impact. What they intended as a cage for displaying subdued opponents became a podium for challenging their entire system. So he decided to give them a history lesson they hadn't scheduled, using their own carefully crafted environment as the setting for a completely different narrative than they expected. The psychological warfare they'd built into the walls would work in his favor, making his message resonate even more powerfully precisely because of the contrast between the intimidating setting and the calm delivery. Look, I've heard speeches in council chambers from the Cygnus system to the Outer Rim. Most follow a predictable pattern: diplomatic platitudes, rehearsed declarations, occasional veiled threats. Rex Valdez started his address sounding exactly like what the council expected: a formal acknowledgement of their authority and an acceptance of terms. He used their own procedural language, mirroring the cadence of surrender so perfectly that several council members actually relaxed into their seats, assuming the performance was over before it really began. Then he pivoted. Not dramatically, not with some grand gesture, but with a slight shift in tone that turned a statement of submission into a manifesto on human nature. He began tracing humanity's relationship with impossibility, not as a history lesson but as a quiet argument against the Council's entire worldview. He talked about how every time someone told humans something couldn't be done, we treated it less as a boundary and more as a challenge waiting for the right stubborn mind to tackle it. The Council expected gratitude for the opportunity to serve. What they received was a calm, methodical philosophy lesson on why their system was fundamentally flawed. Rex was polite, almost conversational, but there was steel in his reasoning. He didn't raise his voice or use dramatic pauses. His delivery was so measured that the revolutionary weight of his words took a moment to land. He wasn't shouting rebellion. He was explaining why rebellion was the only logical response to their offer. His most famous line, "We don't just have a problem with authority. We have a problem with the word impossible," wasn't delivered like a battle cry. It came out like a simple statement of fact, the way someone might note that water is wet or space is cold. That straightforwardness made it resonate even more. It wasn't crafted for drama. It was crafted for truth, and truth tends to echo. The murmurs in the chamber started softly, then grew. Representatives who had been silent for generations began shifting in their seats, exchanging glances. Rex had reframed the entire conflict not as a rebellion against power, but as a disagreement over the very idea of limitation. He was challenging not just the Council's authority, but the mindset that allowed that authority to exist unchallenged for so long. At one point, he had to illustrate his point about their military inexperience. He didn't boast about human victories or list tactical achievements. Instead, he pointed out that the Council's ships were designed to intimidate, not to endure real warfare. Their technology was built around the assumption that no one would ever fight back with genuine conviction. They had created spectacular tools for maintaining control, but very few for surviving a determined opponent. That moment crystallized his entire argument. He wasn't just saying humans were better fighters. He was saying the Council had forgotten what fighting actually meant. Their strength was an illusion sustained by compliance, and once that compliance ended, their weakness became obvious. Let me tell you about the difference between looking powerful and being powerful. Rex revealed that most Council member species had never experienced genuine warfare in their recorded histories. Their military technology followed design principles focused entirely on intimidation and control, rather than combat effectiveness. Their ships boasted polished surfaces and impressive energy signatures that looked formidable in parade formations, but lacked redundant systems or emergency protocols for actual battle conditions. Their weapons were designed to disable and subdue rather than destroy, created for police actions against unarmed populations rather than fighting determined opponents. The Council's entire military infrastructure was built to maintain internal order within their territories, not to win wars against peer adversaries. Their doctrine assumed technological superiority would prevent serious challenges, so they never developed strategies for situations where their technology might be matched or countered. They'd essentially forgotten how to fight real wars because for centuries, nobody had given them reason to remember. Their officers trained for ceremonial duties and border patrols, not for the brutal calculus of survival against an enemy equally determined to prevail. Humanity's experience couldn't have been more different. We'd been fighting for survival since our species first stood upright on a planet that seemed determined to kill us. We understood warfare not as theoretical exercise but as practical necessity, developing strategies through generations of conflict where the stakes were extinction rather than territorial disputes. Our military philosophy prioritized function over form, effectiveness over appearance, and adaptation over tradition. We designed weapons to solve specific problems rather than follow established patterns. This fundamental difference in military philosophy explained why the Council struggled against human resistance. Their forces were prepared for compliant opponents who recognized their technological superiority and accepted defeat as inevitable. They weren't prepared for an enemy that treated their advanced technology as engineering problems to be solved, rather than insurmountable advantages. The Council's ships were designed to win through intimidation. Our ships were designed to win through whatever means worked. The Council's power came from their monopoly on advanced technology, not from any particular competence in warfare. They controlled the manufacturing processes, the energy sources, the communication networks, everything that made advanced civilization possible across their territories. Member species depended on Council technology for everything from transportation to medicine, creating a system of control through dependency rather than through military strength. Their actual combat effectiveness was secondary to their ability to control access to the tools that made modern life possible. So we decided to break that technological monopoly, not by destroying their infrastructure or seizing their facilities, but by creating alternatives that anyone could use. We focused on developing systems that didn't require specialized Council components or proprietary energy sources. Simple, robust technology that could be built with basic materials and maintained without expert technicians. The goal wasn't to match their technological sophistication, but to create options that made their control irrelevant. By providing alternative technologies that member species could adopt independently, we undermined the foundation of Council power without firing a single shot. Their control depended on being the only source of advanced technology. Once other options became available, their influence began to erode. Species that had accepted Council authority out of necessity suddenly had choices they'd never considered possible. The technological monopoly that had sustained their power for centuries became their greatest vulnerability when confronted with alternatives that prioritized accessibility over perfection. You know how the most revolutionary ideas often look like small concessions? The fourth term appeared as a minor procedural footnote in the surrender agreement. It granted member species the right to hold referendums on continued Council membership. On the surface, it looked like a symbolic gesture, one of those diplomatic niceties that never gets used in practice. The Council viewed it as a harmless concession to save face, assuming no species would actually consider leaving their protection. What they missed was how this clause fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of galactic politics. For the first time, leaving the Council became a legally recognized option, rather than an act of rebellion. That distinction mattered more than anyone anticipated. The entire Council power structure depended on member species believing they had no alternative to centralized control. This single paragraph in a lengthy document introduced the concept of voluntary participation to a system built on the assumption of permanent membership. Species that had never considered independence suddenly had a mechanism to achieve it through established legal channels rather than armed conflict. The Council agreed to the term because they operated within their own assumptions about power and control. They saw it as procedural window dressing while we recognized its revolutionary potential. They were so confident in their technological and economic dominance that they couldn't imagine anyone choosing to leave their protection voluntarily. This single clause destabilized their entire power structure by introducing choice where none previously existed. The Council's control mechanism relied on technological dependence and the absence of alternatives. By creating a legal pathway to separation, we gave member species something they'd never had before: options. The psychological impact was immediate, as representatives began quietly discussing what independence might look like for their people. The vote on the surrender terms was closer than expected, passing by a narrow margin that reflected deep divisions within the Council itself. Some members recognized the danger of this provision, while others dismissed it as irrelevant. That split decision revealed the growing cracks in what had seemed like a monolithic power structure. The fourth term became the legal framework for galactic revolution, not because it forced change, but because it made change possible through established procedures. Rather than violent confrontation, Admiral Rex Valdez understood the Council's psychology perfectly when he observed that their system required member species to believe they had no other choice. The moment that belief changed, their authority began to erode. The fourth term planted that seed of doubt in every member species' leadership. They began asking questions they'd never considered before, examining their relationship with the Council through a new lens of possibility rather than inevitability. But legal frameworks alone weren't enough to ensure real change. Species considering independence needed practical means to defend their new freedom against Council retaliation. The referendum mechanism would mean nothing if the Council could simply send a fleet to enforce compliance with the old system. We needed to provide tools that would make independence not just legally possible, but practically sustainable. The fourth term created the opportunity, but we still had to give species the means to seize that opportunity without being immediately crushed by the existing power structure. Look, technology is only revolutionary if people can actually use it. The quantum transmitters we distributed weren't weapons in the conventional sense. They were compact devices about the size of a human handheld communication unit, designed to operate on principles that bypassed the Council's standard communication protocols entirely. We didn't just hand out the finished units. We provided complete technical templates, manufacturing specifications, and energy requirements that could be met with commonly available materials across dozens of different technological bases. This wasn't about giving species better technology. It was about giving them independence from the Council's technological monopoly. The quantum transmitters operated on a specific frequency pulse that interfered with the quantum matrix powering all Council technology. Any device using the Council's standard quantum matrices would experience disruption when these transmitters were active nearby. The effect was temporary and non-destructive, but it created windows of opportunity for secure communication outside Council monitoring. The Council's control had always depended on controlling communication channels and technological access. They maintained their authority by being the sole provider of advanced technology across their territories. Member species relied on Council-maintained networks for everything from interstellar navigation to medical systems to basic infrastructure management. This dependency created a system where challenging Council authority meant risking the collapse of your own civilization's basic functions by providing alternative communication technology that anyone could build and maintain. We made that control obsolete. Species could now communicate securely without relying on Council-monitored channels. They could coordinate, share information, and organize without fearing that every transmission was being analyzed by Council intelligence agencies. The psychological impact was immediate. For the first time, member species had a practical means of operating outside the Council's oversight framework. This technological liberation was the practical component that made the referendum mechanism actually work. Having the legal right to vote on independence meant nothing if the Council could monitor all communications and disrupt organizing efforts. The quantum transmitters provided the privacy and security needed for species to seriously consider their options without immediate retaliation. They could discuss the practical implications of independence, share technical knowledge, and coordinate their responses without Council interference. The combination of legal framework and technological access created irreversible change. Once species realized they could communicate securely and had a legal pathway to independence, the psychological barrier to action disappeared. The Council's power had always depended on the perception that resistance was both impossible and pointless. Now species had both the means to communicate freely and the legal mechanism to pursue independence through established procedures. Rather than armed conflict, quantum transmitters represented something more. Dangerous than any weapon, they represented choice. A weapon can destroy infrastructure or defeat military forces, but it can't create alternatives to an existing power structure. These devices gave species the practical means to envision and build those alternatives themselves. They weren't just breaking the Council's technological monopoly. They were demonstrating that such monopolies were unnecessary in the first place. Which brings us to what happened when species actually started voting on their future relationship with the Council. The combination of legal permission and practical capability created a momentum that the Council couldn't stop through conventional means. They could no longer threaten technological isolation or communication blackouts, because species now had alternatives. The psychological shift was complete, from acceptance of Council authority as inevitable to recognition that other options existed and could be pursued through legitimate channels. Let me describe what happens when a political system reaches critical mass. The first species to declare independence created a cascade effect that spread faster than anyone anticipated. 17 separate systems submitted withdrawal notifications within hours of each other, their declarations arriving at Council headquarters like perfectly timed strategic strikes. This wasn't coordinated rebellion so much as simultaneous realization that the Emperor had no clothes. Once one species demonstrated that independence was possible, others recognized they could follow without facing immediate retaliation. New partnerships formed immediately between these newly independent systems. Defense pacts materialized between species that had barely communicated before, their agreements focusing on mutual protection rather than territorial expansion. Trade agreements bypassed traditional Council-regulated channels, establishing direct economic relationships that reduced dependence on centralized control. Mutual protection treaties created networks of security that made individual systems feel less vulnerable to Council retaliation. These weren't temporary alliances of convenience. They represented fundamental realignments of galactic relationships based on voluntary cooperation rather than imposed hierarchy. The old order couldn't withstand this sudden proliferation of autonomy. The Council's centralized control model was designed to manage compliance through technological dependency and limited communication between member species. When systems started coordinating directly with each other, sharing resources and providing mutual support, that control mechanism collapsed. Their entire governance structure assumed member species would remain isolated and dependent. They had no protocols for handling widespread voluntary cooperation outside their framework. Species that had been silent for generations found their voice through these new networks. Representatives who had previously voted with the Council bloc began advocating for their people's interests independently. The psychological shift was remarkable. Where once there was resigned acceptance of Council authority, now there was active discussion of self-governance models and independent foreign policies. The change wasn't just political. It was cultural, affecting how species viewed themselves and their place in the galaxy. The Council's authority evaporated practically overnight because it was always more illusion than substance. Their power depended on everyone believing in their inevitable control, and once that belief faded, the reality of their limited enforcement capabilities became apparent. They could threaten individual systems, but facing coordinated resistance from multiple independent species with mutual defense agreements was beyond their strategic capacity. Their military was designed for intimidation, not for fighting multiple simultaneous campaigns across different sectors. Their centralized control model couldn't adapt to distributed power because it was built on the opposite principle. Every decision required approval from the core. Every response needed to be coordinated through hierarchical channels, and every action had to fit within established protocols. Faced with rapidly evolving situations across multiple fronts, their bureaucracy became their greatest weakness. They were trying to fight a distributed network with a centralized command structure, and the network was inherently more flexible and responsive. What began as human resistance became a galaxy-wide movement for self-determination, because we provided both the legal mechanism and the practical means for change. The fourth term created the opportunity. The quantum transmitters provided the communication capability, and our military actions demonstrated that Council power could be challenged successfully. But the actual revolution came from species themselves choosing to seize that opportunity once they realized it was possible. So we had to formalize the new reality that was already taking shape across the galaxy. The distributed network of independent systems needed a framework for cooperation that preserved their autonomy while providing stability. The old Council model of centralized control had clearly failed, but complete fragmentation carried its own risks. We needed to create something that could maintain peace and facilitate cooperation without recreating the oppressive structures we'd just escaped. You know how sometimes the most formal procedures can be the most revolutionary? Rex called for a vote of no confidence in the council structure, a move that weaponized their own bureaucracy against them. He didn't storm the chamber with weapons or issue dramatic threats. He simply invoked a procedural mechanism buried deep in their governance documents, one they'd written to create the appearance of accountability without ever expecting anyone to actually use it. This wasn't symbolic theater. The vote carried legal weight under their own constitution, providing a mechanism to dismantle their authority through established channels rather than violent overthrow. We were playing by their rules but with completely different objectives. They'd designed their procedures to create the illusion of participation while maintaining absolute control. By using those same procedures to challenge that control, we turned their system against itself. The council couldn't refuse the vote without revealing the authoritarian nature they'd always denied. Their entire legitimacy depended on maintaining the appearance of fair governance and due process. Blocking a legally constituted motion would demonstrate that their system was fundamentally dishonest, undermining their authority more effectively than any military defeat. They had to allow a vote they knew would likely end their power, because refusing would prove they'd never truly believed in their own principles. The chamber went through the elaborate voting ritual they'd designed centuries earlier. Representatives pressed glowing panels, confirmation signals flashed across displays, and the system tallied results with the same solemn ceremony they used for minor budgetary approvals. The whole process felt like watching someone carefully follow a recipe for their own last meal. They were executing the formalities of their own demise because those formalities were the foundation of their claimed legitimacy. This was bureaucracy weaponized for revolution. While our military actions had demonstrated that council power could be challenged, this vote demonstrated that it could be dismantled through their own systems. The successful outcome transformed rebellion into constitutional change, giving the transition a legitimacy that pure force could never provide. It wasn't about defeating them. It was about proving their system contained the mechanisms for its own replacement. The vote passed by a narrow margin that revealed deep fractures in what had seemed like unified control. Species that had quietly opposed council policies but never dared speak out now had legal cover to express their dissatisfaction. The result triggered immediate chaos in the chamber as representatives realized the structure they'd accepted as permanent was suddenly negotiable. At one point, we had to build what came next. The vote didn't just end the old system. It created the framework for whatever would replace it. The successful no-confidence motion forced the council to accept the dismantling of their authority, while providing a transitional structure to maintain basic governance during the changeover. This wasn't collapse, it was controlled demolition, followed by controlled construction. The transition established that governmental authority must be based on consent rather than control, a concept that resonated across species that had known only hierarchical domination. By using their procedures against them, we demonstrated that true power comes from legitimacy rather than force. The vote created the legal space for something new to emerge from the old system's remains, something based on partnership rather than domination. Look, building something new is harder than tearing down something old. The Galactic Federation of Free Species replaced the old council, but this wasn't just a name change or some administrative reshuffle. It was a complete overhaul of how interstellar governance actually functioned. Where the council centralized power in the hands of a few dominant species, the Federation distributed authority across all member worlds. The emphasis shifted fundamentally from control to consent. Species weren't subjects to be managed, but partners to be heard. Technological independence became a non-negotiable right. Under the council, tech was a tool of control, a monopoly that ensured dependence. The Federation made sure every species could access, develop, and share technology without needing approval from some central authority. That single change dismantled centuries of engineered inequality. Representation expanded dramatically, too. The old council spoke for a narrow set of interests. The Federation's assembly included delegates from dozens of species, many of whom had never had a real voice in galactic affairs before. The new structure recognized that power couldn't be concentrated safely. It had to be distributed, checked, and balanced. Systems could cooperate without being controlled, collaborate without being coerced. Rex Valdez became the unexpected architect of this transition. He wasn't some polished diplomat. He was a military leader who understood that real peace didn't come from dominance, but from dignity. His influence ensured the new Federation wasn't just a rebranded hierarchy. What began as a tactical surrender, humans giving up their isolation and their right to ignore galactic politics, became the foundation for a genuine partnership. We surrendered the option of walking away and gained the responsibility of participation. That shift in mindset was everything. The old council saw membership as compliance. The Federation framed it as voluntary cooperation. So we come to what this all actually meant. It wasn't just about replacing one government with another. It was about replacing a system of fear with a system of trust. The Federation didn't demand obedience, it invited agreement. It didn't punish dissent, it accommodated disagreement. That might sound like Diplomacy 101, but in a galaxy used to ultimatums, it felt like a revelation. Rex's leadership was key because he refused to become what he'd fought against. He made sure the new governance was designed to prevent any one species or any one individual from holding too much power. The systems were transparent, the protocols were open, and the technology was shared. You couldn't hide exploitation behind bureaucracy when the rules were clear to everyone. In the end, the Federation worked not because it was perfect, but because it was flexible. It could adapt. It could listen. And most importantly, it understood that authority shouldn't be inherited. It should be earned again and again through consent and cooperation. That's what made it sustainable. That's what made it different. Which brings us to the central contradiction of the whole story. The paradox that made this revolution possible. Let me leave you with the central irony of this entire story. We surrendered our isolation and that comfortable human right to ignore galactic politics. The very thing we'd fought to preserve, the freedom to be left alone, to tend our own garden, to not get involved in other people's problems. We gave it up voluntarily. What looked like defeat from the outside was actually transformation through strategic concession. We didn't surrender to the Council. We surrendered to the possibility of something better than isolation. In giving up our independence, we became part of something larger than ourselves. That's the tension that defined the whole conflict. We traded the right to be left alone for the responsibility of participation. That shift changed everything. The galaxy learned that surrender could be the beginning rather than the end of something meaningful. Most species saw surrender as final, the closing chapter of a failed resistance. We treated it as the opening move in a different kind of game entirely. Humanity's stubborn refusal to accept inferiority created superior outcomes for everyone. Our greatest weakness, that irritating human tendency to question authority and reject predetermined roles, became our greatest strength through clever redefinition. The Council saw our stubbornness as a character flaw to be managed. We recognized it as the engine of innovation that could drive change across the entire galactic community. What they dismissed as primitive resistance, we leveraged into constructive revolution. This wasn't about winning in the conventional sense. It was about changing the definition of victory itself. We surrendered correctly, but to the right thing, not to their authority, but to the possibility of building something better. The old system treated power as a finite resource to be hoarded and controlled. The new system recognized that real power grows when shared, that authority gains strength through consent rather than coercion. That fundamental shift in thinking made all the difference. The paradox remains that by surrendering our isolation, we gained influence. By accepting responsibility for the broader galactic community, we found more meaningful autonomy than we ever had in solitude. We stopped being the species that wanted to be left alone and became the species that helped others determine their own futures. That transformation, from isolation to participation, from resistance to construction, represents the real victory, which brings us to the final reflection on what this all means for how power actually works in the universe. The Council's authority collapsed not because we defeated them militarily, but because we demonstrated that their model was fundamentally unsustainable. Authority without consent eventually crumbles under its own weight, no matter how impressive the technology or intimidating the architecture. Humanity's rise wasn't about planned triumph. It was about stubborn insistence on making space for other voices, including our own. Sometimes revolution looks less like rebellion and more like stubborn refusal to play by broken rules while offering better ones. In the end, the galaxy learned a stark lesson. Authority without consent is fundamentally fragile. Humanity's rise wasn't a story of planned triumph. It was born of stubborn insistence on dignity within a system that had forgotten what dignity meant. We didn't fight our way to the top. We simply refused to play a rigged game. Sometimes revolution looks less like violent rebellion and more like a quiet, unyielding decision to offer a better way forward, not by tearing others down, but by ensuring everyone gets a say in what gets built.